Carney may have found the one answer Trump never wanted Canada to find, because this is no longer just a fight about tariffs, and it is no longer just another loud political showdown between Washington and Ottawa. This is becoming a fight about leverage, about dependency, and about whether the United States is accidentally teaching one of its closest partners how to slowly build an exit from American pressure. Most people still look at this story and see something simple. Trump threatens Canada. Canada pushes back. Both sides posture. Negotiations restart. And eventually some version of the deal survives. But that reading misses the most important part, because the real weapon here is not only the tariff itself. The real weapon is uncertainty, and uncertainty is much more dangerous than most people realize, because tariffs hurt. But uncertainty changes behavior. It freezes decisions. It delays hiring. It changes supply chains. It scares investors. It weakens factories before laws are even fully rewritten. And once that starts happening, the economic damage begins before the official break ever arrives. That is exactly why the latest reporting out of Windsor matters so much. Because on March 28th, Reuters showed something bigger than a local business problem. It showed what happens when a cross-border industrial city starts living under permanent doubt. Businesses were stalling, training demand was softening, housing was under pressure, and the deeper meaning of that is impossible to ignore, because Windsor is one of the clearest pressure points in the US-Canada industrial relationship, especially in manufacturing and autos. So when Windsor slows, it is not just a symbolic headline. It is a warning that the cost of instability is already moving through the real economy. And here is the problem for Trump. Pain is not the same as control. Causing damage does not automatically produce obedience. Sometimes it produces adaptation. Sometimes it produces political backlash. And sometimes it produces something much more dangerous for the stronger side. It produces a long-term strategy by the weaker side to reduce vulnerability. That is where Mark Carney enters the story in a way most people still underestimate, because he is not acting like a man who believes this is just another short-term trade dispute. He is acting like someone who thinks the deeper problem is that Canada has become too exposed to American political volatility. And if that is the real issue, then responding tariff by tariff is not enough. What matters is reducing the ability of Washington to use market access as a recurring weapon in the future. In other words, Carney's move is not simply retaliation, it is diversification, and diversification in this context is not a slogan. It is a strategic counterattack. Look at the timing of what Canada has been doing, because the pattern is now too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. On March 27, Reuters reported that Canada and Mercosur were nearing a free trade agreement, with another round of talks coming in April and officials suggesting there could be meaningful progress later this year. And that matters far beyond the headline, because Mercosur is not just another trade bloc on a map. It represents optionality, and optionality is power. A country with only one overwhelmingly dominant market can be pressured much more easily than a country that is actively building alternatives, even if those alternatives are not yet large enough to replace the main partner. That distinction is critical, because Canada does not need to replace the United States to change the balance of this conflict. It only needs to make the future of dependence less absolute. Then add what happened earlier this month. On March 2nd, Reuters reported that India and Canada were aiming for a trade pact by the end of the year and had also struck a uranium deal. On March 5th, Reuters reported new agreements between Canada and Australia on critical minerals. And on March 6th, Reuters reported that Japan, France, and Canada were working on alternatives involving strategic supply chains and rare earths. Now put those pieces together with Carney's previously announced push toward India, Australia, and Japan, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. This is not one random diplomatic tour. This is not one isolated trade conversation. This is a strategic map being redrawn in real time. Carney appears to be betting that if the United States is going to make dependence feel dangerous, then Canada needs to make diversification feel urgent, legitimate, and necessary. Now, this is where a lot of people either oversimplify or exaggerate. So it is important to be precise. Canada is not suddenly escaping the U.S. economy overnight. It is not replacing American demand tomorrow, and it is not breaking the North American industrial model in one sweep. That would go far beyond what current facts support, because the United States remains overwhelmingly central to Canadian trade. Canadian supply chains are deeply integrated with American manufacturing, and sectors like autos still depend heavily on that relationship. But that does not weaken the thesis of this video. It actually strengthens it, because the real strategic shift does not require total separation. It only requires movement at the margin. It requires more options, more bargaining room, more access points, more non-US pathways for investment and exports, more strategic partnerships in energy, minerals, and industrial inputs. And most importantly, it requires a political shift inside Canada where dependence on the US is no longer seen as a neutral fact of geography, but as a vulnerability that must be managed. That is the trap America built, and it is deeper than tariffs. For decades, the structure of North American trade gave Washington an enormous silent advantage, because Canada's economy was integrated so tightly with the United States that the assumption of continued access did a lot of the work on its own. America did not need to threaten constantly, because the architecture already created dependence. But once a dependent country starts believing that access itself has become politically unstable, the architecture stops feeling like security and starts feeling like exposure. And that is when the logic changes. The more Trump uses uncertainty as leverage, the more he may be proving Carney's case that Canada cannot afford to remain this exposed forever. And that matters not just for trade, but for everything attached to trade: jobs, factories, training, capital flows, industrial planning, mineral strategy, energy positioning, and even long-term diplomacy. Investors do not wait for final legal collapse before they adjust behavior. Manufacturers do not wait until the last possible second to rethink sourcing. Boards do not wait for a formal treaty breakdown before they start building contingencies. They react to risk, and when risk becomes political, persistent, and hard to price, money begins to search for resilience. That is why Reuters reporting from Windsor is so powerful, because it gives us a real-world glimpse of how leverage works before it becomes law. Uncertainty alone is already enough to slow a city, cool investment, reduce training demand, and squeeze confidence. But again, this is where the story flips, because the same uncertainty that hurts Canada in the short run can help Carney in the medium run, politically, strategically, and diplomatically, because it makes diversification easier to justify at home and easier to explain abroad. If you are Carney, this is the argument you want Canadians, allies, and investors to understand. The problem is not one tariff here or one threat there. The problem is that the United States may now behave like an unreliable economic anchor. And if that is true, then Canada must start widening its strategic corridor, not later, now. That is why Mercosur matters, why India matters, why Australia matters, why critical minerals matter, why uranium matters, why rare earth supply chains matter, because all of them reduce the cost of over-reliance on a single partner. And when that partner is openly signaling that trade access can be weaponized again and again, diversification stops looking like a luxury and starts looking like self-defense. There is also a broader geopolitical cost for Washington here, one that goes beyond Canada. If the United States repeatedly teaches allies that dependence on the American market can be turned into a political liability at any time, then even countries that remain closely aligned with Washington will start building hedges, not because they want a divorce, but because they want insurance. And insurance is expensive for the country that used to benefit from everyone else's dependence. This is how great powers slowly erode their own leverage, not by losing one dramatic showdown, but by overusing pressure until partners adapt. That is the real danger for Trump's strategy. It may still inflict pain, but each new round of pain could produce less compliance and more long-term repositioning. And once that process starts, even modest diversification matters, because leverage is not an all-or-nothing game. If Canada can deepen ties with Mercosur, if it can move faster with India, if it can strengthen strategic supply links with Australia, Japan, and European partners, if it can use critical minerals and energy-related assets to become more valuable in a wider network, then the United States faces a different kind of Canada in the future, not a Canada that no longer needs America, but a Canada that is harder to corner. That alone would change the math of every future negotiation, because coercion works best when the weaker side has nowhere to go, and Carney's apparent strategy is to make sure that statement becomes less true every year. This is why the official story: Trump pressures Canada. Canada absorbs the blow, and the U.S. keeps the upper hand, may be badly incomplete. The real story may be that Trump is forcing Canada to build the exact habits Washington should least want to encourage: trade diversification, geopolitical hedging, supply chain rethinking, and a domestic consensus that overdependence on the U.S. is strategically reckless. Once that consensus hardens, it does not disappear with one handshake or one renegotiated clause. It becomes part of national planning. And if that happens, then every future American threat becomes slightly less effective than the previous one. Now here is the deeper irony. Trump's strength in this conflict comes from America's size, market power, and central role in North American production. But if that strength is used in a way that convinces Canada to permanently treat dependence as a danger, then the use of strength begins to weaken the foundation of the leverage itself. In other words, Trump may still be winning the short-term pressure contest while quietly losing the long-term structural contest. And for a country like the United States, losing structural leverage over a neighbor as strategically important as Canada is not a minor side effect. It is a major geopolitical cost when people ask whether Carney is really escaping the trap America built. The right answer is not that the escape is complete. It is that the escape may already have begun as a strategic process. It begins with small moves, new talks, new supply agreements, new minerals partnerships, new diplomatic lanes, new trade corridors, and above all, a new assumption inside Canada that the old model may no longer be safe enough to trust without backup. That is how the board changes, not with one dramatic headline, but with a slow shift in what leaders, investors, and industries now consider rational. And if Carney is succeeding in that shift, even partially, then Trump may have made the most dangerous mistake any stronger power can make. He may have shown the weaker side exactly why it needs to stop depending on him. That is why this story is much bigger than tariffs, much bigger than one trade review, and much bigger than one bad month in Windsor. It is about whether American pressure is preserving U.S. influence or teaching its closest partners to build exits from it. And if it is the second one, then the bill is going to be much larger than most people think, because once a country starts redesigning its dependence, it does not simply go back to the old assumptions. So the real question is no longer whether Trump can hurt Canada today. Clearly he can. The real question is whether Mark Carney has already started building a Canada that will be much harder for America to pressure tomorrow. And if that is what we are watching, then this may be one of the most important strategic reversals in the entire U.S.-Canada confrontation. Do you think Carney is building a real long-term escape from American leverage? Or is this still just short-term positioning before the next round of negotiations?